Hi, geographers. Let's talk about some more terms from Chapter 4. So we're going to look specifically or more deeply at diffusion. We mentioned it before in a previous video lesson. And we're also going to look at assimilation. So let's start with a couple of key concepts that occur when we look at the bigger picture of what cultural diffusion is. So we know that cultural components begin in a particular location or a hearth, and then they spread outward. In some cases, they don't spread very far and they dwindle away, or in some places they can spread globally, depending upon what kind of outlet those things have for diffusion. Like, is it a social network thing that can go across the globe as quickly as a tweet or something in TikTok, and can you pick something up that originated in Bangkok and now we're doing it in Bryant, right? And so these kinds of pathways or movement across the land of ideas or goods and services, that component of Mr. Help, is what we're talking about with diffusion. But there is a concept called re-territorialization that is specific to cultural geography. As a matter of fact, if you do a Google search for this term re-territorialization, I believe that you're going to see a lot of like business world kind of or business administration type results, search results when you type into Google this word. And so I'm not going to use it in the same way that maybe a business administration kind of person would use it, but re-territorialization for a geographer has to do with when a cultural concept diffuses from its original cultural hearth and becomes a component. Locals reinvent that particular type of activity or style or way of life or habit or custom or ritual. They reinvent it and they make it their own. So for instance, there's a large section in Chapter 4 on music festivals, and these festivals bring a whole lot of different types of music to the public sphere, and you can diffuse different styles of music from a particular location all throughout the world. And so one of the topics that you can study and look at the way diffusion of music happens is the hip-hop revolution of the late 1970s and early 80s. And so with hip-hop culture, there are several components of behavior and style and art that have to do with hip-hop, from graffiti to dancing and to emceeing and rhyming and all of these different types of components of hip-hop culture. But as hip-hop spread around the world, the original voice in hip-hop was about oppression and having a voice against the dominant forces in society, being able for the little guy to have an outlet for political voice or for help alleviating poverty and these kinds of things. This is where it came from in the United States. And as you see that being spread around the world, it takes a different personality in Thailand or in Tunisia or in South Africa or wherever you see in the world that has a vibrant hip-hop culture. There are different components to it. Typically, it has to do with oppression and having a voice for those who have traditionally felt oppressed, but there might not necessarily be hip-hop associated with it or dance associated with it, at least not in the same way that it originated in the United States, because different cultures have different beliefs about dance or dress or artwork or, what can be depicted in artwork and that kind of thing. And so you don't see some of the same elements of hip-hop culture, say, in Argentina that you would in LA or in New York. There's even distinct differences from East Coast to West Coast in the hip hop world, as some of you know. So re-territorialization occurs in diffusion when the local culture makes it their own, makes some kind of cultural feature their own. And so it happens a lot with popular culture as it gets diffused around urban areas, and that it goes from say Paris to Marrakesh to Buenos Aires to Mexico City to LA and all. Pardon me, my hair's getting blown everywhere. All of the different big cities as it goes from one nucleus to the next and then diffuses throughout the landscape from those areas. Re-territorialization takes place when a local culture adopts that particular aspect of popular or modern culture, but does not adopt it without modification, changes it so that it matches the local flavor and the local attitudes of the people in that particular area. And then it becomes their own way of life, their own component of local culture, rather than some kind of invasive species, so to speak, something that invaded them and tried to change them. They took that and changed it to fit their needs rather than letting it change them. So that's reterritorialization. Appropriation is typically in modern society, you hear this word with identity politics. If you try to behave or adopt different attitudes or ideas or styles of life that typically are affiliated with this ethnicity, this race, this gender, this sexuality, etc. In identity politics, appropriation is seen as a very bad word, but it's not always necessarily bad. Sometimes, especially in the capitalist world, you can appropriate or take a certain cultural way, take a certain habit, take a certain product, take a certain marketable good or service, and you can use it and modify it intentionally to fit a particular market where you can sell something. So for instance, I think it was chapter 1 in the textbook. You can flip back to look at some of the pictures there. You see a picture of like a McDonald's counter with a menu behind it, and it's got a lot of vegetarian options, and none of the options at this McDonald's counter are beef, because it's a McDonald's counter in a town in India where beef is prohibited to eat, at least among Hindu populations. And therefore, does that mean that the McDonald's Corporation is not going to try to go and make a market in India and sell their products there? No, we're going to take that cultural belief that beef is off limits, and we're going to adjust our menu. We're going to appropriate that culture and make our product marketable for that particular consumer. And so these are different concepts that you need to review from chapter 4. And then also assimilation. Assimilation, especially within the last few years, is an extremely bad word. You can look, for instance, it's typically considered a colonial type word where powerful cultures that invaded other areas got the indigenous culture, rounded up the indigenous culture and forcibly made them change their language, change their belief system, change everything in order to behave like the dominant ideology and the dominant group in the area. And that certainly happened in some cases, but it is not as forceful. There's a lot of hyperbole in the stories that you will hear about colonialization forcing indigenous ways, out the door. So it's not always forceful assimilation. Often groups of people intentionally assimilate, especially if they migrate if they immigrate with an E from their original country and become immigrants with an I to another country. A lot of times the purpose for doing that is to get rid of their individual purpose, like the pull and the push factors that they are responding to. A lot of times that has to do with shedding their old ways and intentionally assimilating into society. I have some friends who are third generation Mexican immigrants, and the granddaughter is being told by her mother and her grandmother, you will not do what we did. You will go to school. You will do these American things, not these traditional Mexican things, so that you will assimilate into and have a different lifestyle than we ourselves experienced. And so on that very micro scale, a lot of times families encourage people to assimilate into the larger dominant culture. But assimilation is not necessarily always a forceful thing, and it's not necessarily always a bad thing or received badly by a particular group of people. So yes, immigrant with an I, somebody that's coming into an area, into a place. Sometimes indigenous populations or the aboriginal or the people who occupied the land prior to another culture taking over, a lot of times assimilation is imposed on indigenous groups, or sometimes indigenous groups are segregated from the invading or colonializing culture and live kind of a parallel, excuse me, a parallel cultural existence. It happened a lot in South Africa, which there were terrible atrocities of exclusion and oppression and violence against Native populations there. So please look at these two words, look at the concepts that are reviewed in chapter 4, and I will see you in our next lesson. Bye.